Good evening. IPDET 2012, day 12 for some of you, and day 2 for others of you. Welcome. We have a speaker this evening who has traveled a long way to be with us. She has come from the Netherlands to give us this presentation. Now, why did we bring someone in all the way from the Netherlands? Hopefully she isn't too jet-lagged. But why did we do that? Well, one of the reasons is, and those of you in the Corps showed a lot of interest in this complexity theory, this tool SenseMaker, and the Cynefin ideas of Dave Snowden. And so I told you that I could not really present much on SenseMaker because I had not used it. We have somebody who uses it almost daily, who has worked with Dave Snowden and is very much a practitioner of this new method and this new way of collecting stories or fragments of stories and putting them together in a way that can be analyzed along several dimensions. So those of you who are new to week 3 may still have heard of this new way of collecting a mass amount of information, a lot of stories across a wide population, and then having that information so that it can really give you a picture and numbers that can be quantified and arrayed to get a much fuller picture than you would have had without it. And perhaps even some surprises, because we talked about how sometimes it's the small, unexpected kind of intervention that gives you a large effect. And we talked about different kinds of complexity, and we saw the video on a child's birthday party. I likened complexity to raising a child versus the simplicity maybe of making a cake and following a recipe. Our speaker will get much more into these issues. Our speaker is Irene Guijt, and she is a independent consultant. She might be interested in joining our new group that we've been forming of independent consultants, independent practitioners. She is not only a very, very busy and active independent practitioner, she is also mother to a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. So she's a very, very busy lady, and given the field work she does, we are particularly happy that she was available and could come in to share her experience. She has a doctorate. Actually, by training before that, she's an irrigation engineer. Right? Quite, you think, unlikely to become someone who's engaged in more participatory methods. But she went through, it sounds like she was in a very groundbreaking program that didn't stop with just measuring the usual effects of irrigation, but had you really probe. So she also has received her doctorate in the Netherlands in 2008. And was telling me about their practice, where you might have 150 people on hand to watch you address the questions from your committee, which sounds like a very different experience. But meanwhile, now she's very, very active in doing some of these projects with SenseMaker, and it's not unusual for her to have 5 or more of these efforts going at the same time. So we really welcome her. We really welcome this experience, her working with Dave Snowden, who's sort of maybe the godfather of this, at least as it seems to be spreading like wildfire across organizations. And I think I mentioned the Rockefeller Foundation is working very much with this method and with this tool, trying to collect stories on a vast, vast number of participants. Without further ado then, I'm going to ask you to give a good IPDET 2012 welcome to Irene Guijt.
Okay, I wanted to start by saying that it's really a great opportunity to be here. I was telling Ray and Linda that for many years I've been trying to figure out how I can attend IPDET, so this is my way of attending it. Not quite in the place that I would have imagined. And what I want to share with you is the journey. I'm in the middle of a journey with SenseMaker, and it's very much exploratory. It's very challenging, extremely exciting, sometimes very moving. I've cried more doing SenseMaker than any other kind of evaluation process, but it's also very exhausting. And I wanted to start first with some voices in the room. I've also reached the age where I have to do this, I'm afraid, to read. Okay, here's two stories from some of the SenseMaker work I'm doing in Rwanda. Is there anyone from Rwanda in the room, by the way? Yay! Well, voices from Rwanda. Here's a couple. These are two stories from 12-year-old girls. I heard of a girl who was my neighbor. She was 10 years old. The man could buy her sweets. Later, he told her to go out with him, and they went to a bar. He bought her a Fanta after they went home. He continued to buy her some gifts. Then he impregnated her. At home, they chased her, and the man also abandoned her. Now she was on the road begging for survival. Another story. A friend of mine came to visit me. Then we went in another place together just for funny. This is literal, right? When she went back home, she was beaten because she didn't finish her task before she came to visit me. She'd been beaten because she was the only one girl in the family, and she was the one who must do everything. So I'm going to explain how SenseMaker works using this Rwanda process in which we're still in the middle. And these are some of the voices in the room that we are trying to put on the table in the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Economic Affairs so they can start to connect with the realities of their future citizens. Essentially, my interest in SenseMaker is because it brings humanity back into our evaluation processes. I sometimes get very tired of abstract numbers or generic statements. And it's the people's voices that I'm finding extremely powerful. So I'm going to position myself a little bit more clearly so you can understand where I'm coming from and why I think some of this work is very useful. I have one case study prepared in detail. I'd like to lift the tip of a veil on another case study just so you get a sense of diversity of how you could use SenseMaker, and then a couple of challenges for the evaluation profession. I have a timekeeper, and I trust on you. Okay, I think it's important that we understand the context in which we are in, and in fact, some of the context is very conducive to the SenseMaker approach. This is I don't know if you've seen this Google map, but it's Facebook. It's all the links, and you can see that there's enormous amounts of links where the intensity is very light, but it's also very unequitable. So social networks as a very important aspect of the world we live in. A lot of uncertainty, interconnectivity, the 2.0 society, aid as a sideshow. And I think that's a very important one because development continues, but aid as the vehicle for development is becoming less and less relevant. And we're having to look at other players, much fewer dollars, or at least questioning of the dollars. In the Netherlands, we're really having to fight a battle to maintain our 0.8 commitment. And it's not an easy battle. Open data as an opportunity. How can you get data out there, use the Aid Transparency Initiative? Development disillusion. A lot of people questioning and very much related to the reducing dollars. And shifting players, foundations, China, Brazil now a donor status. So all these aspects are coming into play in a context where we're also starting to question more and more really what development is about. This is a diagram that I'm not expecting you to be able to read, but it illustrates the complexity with which of issues that we're dealing with. What are we trying to change? This is a diagram, and in the middle, right here, can you see my mouse? Is the farmer, the sugarcane farmer. And this is the web in which the sugarcane farmer operates at the local, which is the green, the national, which is the pink, and the blue, the international level. So changing this process is really, it's the systemic change that I had in my title. It's about, for me, development is very much about transformational development, and it's therefore a lot about tackling these deep-rooted ideas, changing the institutions, questioning power structures. These are very, very difficult things to measure. Long lead times, lots of actors. How are we changing processes? In my thesis, I raised this observation based on 10 years of work in Brazil of messy partnerships. We no longer have single contracts to an organization who is responsible for delivering a product. Over the time span needed to shift the situation for the sugarcane farmers, for example, you need lots of different collaborations, partnerships come and go, overlapping funding grants, and so it's a very, oops, that's not the messy partnership, that's my messy office. This is the, here we go. One of the applications of SenseMaker, which I'm not going to talk about, is the organic cotton chain, and together with people in the cotton chain in December last year in India, we mapped out all the different players that are needed to shift the system. So how do we know whose voices matter? This is also part of what has been my interest in SenseMaker. What do we need to know? I was told that a lot of you have seen this weird diagram. Who's familiar with this diagram? A few people who were awake then at that particular point. It's the Cynefin framework. It's not an important, the term is not important, but the concept here is absolutely critical. And when I saw this diagram, suddenly a whole bunch of pennies dropped, and I realized why a lot of the monitoring and evaluation work that I had seen was not effective. Essentially, this diagram says, if you want to have ways of knowing, and if you want to have ways of managing that knowledge, you have to understand whether you're dealing with a simple reality in which there is a short relationship between your cause and your effect, where you can standardize the effects, and therefore indicators make a lot of sense, and you can plan and you can predict. Or if you are in some of the other domains, in the complicated domain, you have a whole range of different variables that will, depending on the context, lead to different kinds of outcomes, but within the realm of the known. And there you have indicators as well, but you also have expert judgment that comes in. And experts, I don't mean people who have PhDs necessarily, but the girls in Rwanda are experts in their context about their own lives. And here we're talking much more about good practice, and standardizing evaluation processes becomes less useful. It's more fine-tuned. The work that I'm interested in, and the previous slides that connected systemic change and messy partnerships were intended to illustrate that, is that of the complex, where you don't know ahead of time exactly where the journey is going to lead. You have a general idea of where you want to get, but you have no idea which of the many pathways are going to be successful. And so you have to be open to emerging information as it presents itself. And you have to have, instead of anticipation, which is much more useful in the right, you're on the right-hand side of that diagram, you have to move into a state of what Dave Snowden calls anticipatory awareness. So how do we, and in a way it's about shifting from evaluation into monitoring much more, because evaluation comes after the fact. It's too late to change things. It's on time to change things for the next phase, but in the complex domain, you need to keep track so you can adjust and adapt. So it's in that context where SenseMaker has emerged as an approach. I won't talk about the chaotic or the disorder now. Chaotic is essentially thinking on your feet, and disorder is when you don't really know which of the contexts you're actually operating in. And the point about this slide, why I want to spend a bit of time on it, a lot of our evaluation and planning tools assume a simple or complicated reality, when in fact a lot of what we're trying to move actually is in the complex domain. And that's where we get sometimes a very awkward mismatch, I believe is what I'm trying to say, between the tools we use for the job and what we actually need to know. So here we have the tiny ship of order of our evaluation practice that is telling us with precisely how we want to need to know things ahead of time, and in fact we're operating in a vast sea of chaos. This brings me into the sense maker realm, because narrative is it's the basis of the sense maker approach. It's saying narrative, people's views of how they live their lives, is the basis of that anticipatory awareness. You have nothing else except the experience in the moment. You don't know you can't retrospectively measure. So that's where empowerment requires narrative, and narrative is the basis of that, of the sense maker approach. I'm going to skip over this quote and go straight into the case study. So why I was drawn to, and I am drawn and continue to be drawn to sense maker, even though it's a painful experiment at times, is that it does allow you to move and question some of the hypotheses and assumptions on which your program is based. It's very dynamic, but how do you capture that? It's also based on the notion of diversity matters. If you're in the sea of chaos, you need to know where there's a whale there, or where there's a shoal of fish, or where there's a reef. You need to have all those different perspectives out there to be able to guide that ship. So diversity is extremely important. In the experiences I'll mention, the pilots are 2,000 stories. That's a lot of stories. You know, it's a lot of material. And I liken the example I sometimes use to explain what SenseMaker does is it allows, you all know what a tapestry is? It's like an embroidery. So if we get back to the notion of a tapestry, each fragment, each story is a stitch in that embroidery, and the more stitches you have and the finer they are, the clearer you will get the picture. Or it's like a computer screen. For those of you who aren't into embroidery, it's pixels. If you have 4 pixels in your screen, you're not going to be able to read anything. But in high resolution, each fragment is a pixel. You can get a very sharp picture of what is happening at a particular moment in time. So how do we understand lots of them? Girls in the room, girls' voices in the room. The work that we started last May is a collaboration that is taking place in northern Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Rwanda. And it's a collaboration between DFID and Nike Foundation. And they're trying to unleash the girl effect, as they call it. They have social media people who are trying to infuse the gender domain with some whiz-bang marketing tricks, such as that little diagram in the top right. The world could use a good kick in the pants. They've got a lot of very interesting what they call game-changing communications that they're unleashing. In Rwanda, it's something called Ninyaminga. Ninyaminga, what does it mean? Ninyaminga. Good go, yeah. So they're trying to brand work and get the communities and the national conversations to shift in favor of seeing girls as important, not just assets, but as worthy of development in their own rights. So they're trying to shift the national and global systems, and they're also trying to work with what they call, with partners, what they call scale partners. There's all this jargon involved, and gatekeepers, so that attitudes change in relation to adolescent girls. Yeah, so that's just the context. In Rwanda, we are going national after the initial pilot. Our pilot was about 1,600 stories. I'll show you a few in a moment. And that took place over quite a short period of time. In a few weekends, we collected those stories and we analyzed them during a couple of weeks. But of course, permission had to be asked, and we had to design the framework. So it all stretched out to about 8 or 9 months. As the program, there's a 12+ program, which is about working with 12-year-old girls as it goes national. We'll be scaling up and embedding the story process in that. In Ethiopia, we're focusing on 2 regions, which are a lot of people, 56 million, and we're going to try and do in both of them, we're going to try to do them before and an after, a with and a without exposure to Girl Hub to contrast and to be able to get the comparisons that we are all interested in to see, well, is Girl Hub having an effect? And the same is happening in Rwanda with a pipeline design. As new girls come on stream, they will become incorporated in the program, and we'll be able to see the girls before they start the program and as they progress through the program. We're also tracking parents' approaches to children, to girls, parents of girls who are in the program and not in the program. So we have a lot of cohorts where we can do some interesting analysis. If you remember nothing else from my story, this is the slide to remember from a practical point of view, okay? This is really how SenseMaker works. Essentially, you have some kind of way to prompt your story source, let me make them less human, the person from whom you want a story, a prompt to share a story. Everybody gets the same prompt. It's very simple. In Rwanda, we are simply asking, please think about what it's like to be a girl in your context, and give me a story, or please share a story about a moment when you felt encouraged or discouraged about being a girl. Very open and intentionally open. And it's because you're dealing in the complex domain, you don't necessarily know what you need to know. You have to be open for the diversity of perspectives that are shared. Stories are collected, and there's all kinds of different modalities for that we're trying out. What is very, very important and very different from any other approach that I know in evaluation or in fact in research is that then the story sources they signify their own stories. So normally I would be asking you for 4 stories, and then I would go away and huddle for a few weeks in my little office, and I would give all kinds of codes to it, put it in vivo, but it would be my understanding of your worlds that would be biasing my reading of that reality. And in this case, it's the 12-year-old girls that are also interpreting their own stories and are telling me what is relevant. And I'll show you a little bit about how that works. So it's a question framework. The patterns are then visualized. Once we have 400 stories or 800 stories or 2,000 stories, there's a piece of software, which if we have time, I can briefly just open and show you, and it visualizes the patterns. You do not read the stories before you read the pattern. Look at the patterns. And again, that's a reversal of methodology compared to all that I know. You first look at the visual patterns that it says. At what end of the scale? How are they distributed? And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. And only once you have a cluster, because you cannot possibly absorb 2,000 stories, once you have a cluster of 26 or 33, you look at those stories and you say, okay, these are stories of girls who have indicated that their story is about violence in which they were forced to do something and they didn't want to do. And what is that pattern telling us? Yeah? What was very shocking, I'll come to the shocking thing in a moment. What is, again, very different for an evaluation profession is that you don't then present this as an answer. You bring the patterns back and the story clusters back to your clients, to the organization, the Ministry of Health, or in my case, I have discussions with Girl Hub, and I say, okay, what does this mean for you? The 12+ program has nothing on sexual violence. 191 stories of these girls are all about them being molested sexually. Where does what you're trying to move connect with their realities? And so you have discussions around what these realities are showing, and it allows people to evaluate, to realign what it is that they're trying to move. So you act. And the patterns that you want to see more of, because we also look for positive patterns, so what can we do to see more of these patterns, to see more of these stories, are you do that, but you can also initiate activities to dampen the patterns that you want to see less of. So bringing it back to the complexity domain of Cynefin, you set up a series of experiments, as it were, because you're trying to figure out which pathway is going to get you to that final goal. It's a very different way of working. So the point is, what you need for this is lots of narratives. This morning I was working with IDRC, the International Development Research Center, and we were trying to figure out whether we could get enough stories to justify SenseMaker, and we're not sure yet. You really need a lot. It doesn't make sense for less than 100 or 200 stories. It's about emergence, so allowing it, you have to be comfortable with ambiguity, and it's about contextualized statistics. It's not just a statistic, but it's a statistic in relation to the narrative. Yeah? So this is what it looks like. Those of you who are in the back might not be able to see this that well, but basically what you're looking at is a written story here, and then these are some of the questions that are asked. For example, this is the Girl Hub work. This story has to do with the skills of girls, how girls are socially connected, and the confidence of girls. This is another novel aspect that I'd never encountered before in any kind of research method. People are asked to signify in relation to a triangle. Usually it's a multi-choice. Is your story about A, B, or C? And so you will get, yes, my story is about social connections. But it could be that actually it's 70% about social connections, 20% about the skills, and 10% about the confidence of girls. So how would you get that subtlety? And the triangle, the girls, they put a dot or an X in the triangle to show the relative balance between the three elements of the triad. Not everything in life can be squashed into a triangle, so we also have multi-choice questions, as you can see in at the bottom right. Visually, you won't be able to read it, but visually. And there's also something called a dyad, which is essentially a Likert scale going both ways with two extremes. Here we are asking, your story discussed behavior or the life path for girls that is, on the one hand, completely confirming traditions, for you on the right, or confronting traditions and upsetting. And analytically, that's giving us a lot of richness. So we're able to say, okay, girls who are in the middle, who are saying, this is kind of upsetting the system, what are they talking about? What is it, if we're finding positive stories about from girls where they're confronting traditions, what can we go back to the stories and see what made those possible? Yeah? So this is how the methodology actually works. I won't go into this at the moment. So how do we get to our questions? You've all been working, those of you who were in the first 2 weeks of the course have done a lot of work on coming to evaluation questions, I was told. We do something called concept mapping. So what I did last year with Girl Hub is I actually asked them to tell the staff to tell stories about their experiences so far and what they were trying to, tell a story about what you would like to see happen. So we mapped out all the different kind of concepts, and they were concepts like agency and voice and power and safety and isolation, and they're hard things to measure. So from that, we then developed kind of a rough guide, a rough question guide, and over a number of iterations, we honed it down to 26 questions. These questions, I think there's still too many. For the Ethiopia work, we've cut a couple, even more, because you basically want to have it over and done with in half an hour. If you want scale, if you want numbers of stories, you can't spend a lot of time with one respondent. So these are some of the questions around respect by adults, behavior, are girls valued or not, emotions, how does your story make you feel, an extremely important analytical one that we use a lot. And we had it screened by gender specialists. And it was quite interesting because the gender specialists said, oh, you can't possibly ask about violence, it's far too personal. And in fact, a lot of the stories were stories about violence. And if we'd asked, if we'd followed that, the assumptions from the experts, we would have really missed out on a huge part of that reality. So we were stubborn. Okay. So once you have all your stories, you get into analysis. You visualize some of these patterns. I'm assuming that you can't read what's here. Can you read any of that in the back? No. Yeah, a bit? Oh, okay. Basically, there's different functions in the analytical software. So what happens is that the stories are uploaded into one database, and it allows you to take a look at all the items at the same time. Here we can see, for example, that 230 stories were about violence and 125 about insecurity. You already have a pattern there that is worth probing, compared to, for example, 11 items on security. And you don't want to ignore the 11 items on security because they are potentially important weak signals. It's something that Dave talks about a lot in his work, weak signals, and I'll come back to that and remind me if I don't. There is a question in this framework about the level of how girls have internalized violence or not. You know, the violence you describe in your story, is it acceptable to you or not? Do you feel you deserve it, or is it unacceptable? And what about others? Do they think it's acceptable or not, to try and identify those differences? So here you can see that 164 stories are about violence that you find unacceptable, but 142 that others find acceptable. So you get some very interesting entry points already by looking at this into the data, saying, well, that needs to be explored further. Girls' choice. We have a question about girls' choice. The girls did something and didn't want to in 176 of these stories. This was, I'm trying to think, this was when we had 391 in the database. We now have 1,540, I think. So it's a large proportion of stories. This moves you beyond, oh, that's an anecdote, it can't be taken seriously. Yeah, this brings body to it. So this is one way into some of those patterns. And then you start to dig down. And we did some of the analysis with the Girl Hub staff so that they could start to get familiar with what this work meant for them. So here we have another screenshot of what the analytical software looks like. And in a couple of days, you can actually get quite an interesting insight, enough to provoke a conversation about issues that might not have been on the radar. You're looking at the cluster function in Explorer, where I took, and there's 391 stories in here. First, it's only girls. I made it a dynamic query. You can do Boolean and dynamic queries, where I isolated those stories where girls had indicated that they did something and didn't want to do it, and they had also indicated that there was violence in the story. Yeah, so you can really move into subclusters. And you can then isolate, you can ring, what they call ring band. You can put a little ring. Maybe I should just show you on the software. I'll show you how it works. Very quickly, restore previous session. And while it's loading that, I'll go back to this. It allows you to isolate little stories and say, for example, here you have a beautiful example of a weak signal. Yeah, it's where adults let the girls decide what to do. So we have a triangle here, one of the triad questions. Adults listened to the girls, adults ignored the girls, or adults let girls decide. So here the stories, the girls indicated that adults let us decide. I did something that I didn't want to, and it was related to violence. So that is curious. It's thought-provoking. What could that possibly be? Right? So you'd want to look at those stories. Remember that I said you first look at the patterns and then you go to the stories? There's a really good cognitive reason for that. It's called confirmation bias. When we read stuff, at a certain point, we have patterns that are entrenched in our brains, and we keep reading the same thing over and again, even though what we're reading is actually telling you something different. And so you try to delay this process of confirmation bias with this kind of method. And confirmation bias is a danger for us, for our species. So here we have, sorry, I have to do this a bit. So here we have the Explorer software. Here we have an example of what a screen like that looks like. You're looking here at 1,529. Okay, so the database has grown. Not all of the people, not all of the parents and girls who wrote a story answered this particular question, which is about the themes, 1,446, not that that's relevant, but I just wanted to show you what you can do. Is here we have a cluster, for example, that is quite common, not super common, not entirely rare, and it's challenging behavior. So I haven't looked at the stories yet. You have 20 stories, and they will pop up. So if you're in a workshop with Ministry of Health staff, for example, you would obviously prepare this ahead of time so you know, these are the patterns they need to look at. But you would then put this in front of them and say, now what does this mean for you? Does it resonate? Does it challenge your assumptions? And in a workshop that I ran in Kenya related to some of the violence related to Al-Shabaab, where we had a SenseMaker project as well, we identified messages from, or kind of insights from the clusters we were reading that confirmed the relevance of the strategy, those that challenged the relevance of the strategy, and those that were odd and we just couldn't place. And the same afternoon, after a day of analysis, they said, okay, we now need to change this, maintain this, step that up. So in terms of the adaptive management cycle, it's very fast. So here you get the types of stories. They're awful. Here's a story. I was sad when I heard a girl went to be a house girl in Kigali. She was pregnant when it was time to give birth. She went in the toilet and threw the baby. She was taken to the police and arrested her until now. So we were very emotional when we were reading all this because you have to make sense of this. But it gives you an idea of how you can use the interaction between the stories and the statistics. Yeah? Okay, getting back to the presentation. Well, I won't go into these details. What is it doing? The so what question. Why bother? At the moment, it's already being used to redesign the 12 Plus program. I mentioned that they now have a module on sexual violence when it wasn't even on the horizon before. The Niña Minga is a social communications mechanism. It's a magazine attached to a radio program that's also then discussed in these 12 Plus training sessions. And they are not sure that they're actually filling Niña Minga with experiences and issues that actually relate to girls' needs. And so these stories are feeding into that social communications work. And those in turn are being used as the intervention. So you get the stories being used to evaluate the intervention as well as be the intervention, which is again an extremely uncomfortable place for a traditional evaluation to be. You don't want to influence the evaluation, the intervention. You want to study it from the outside. Sensitizing government, voice in the room. The Ministry of Health in Rwanda was rather skeptical, apparently, the people involved, skeptical of SenseMaker, understandably so. So they asked for an attitude survey. The attitude survey, if it can be believed, seems to indicate that there's no problem with girls in Rwanda and that girls are valued as highly and that certainly there's no issues around violence. And so now it's up to the Ministry of Health, what's legitimate in terms of evidence? Yeah? Is it the girls' stories or is it the attitude survey? So some raising some difficult issues. And then debates in the communities, which is what we're now trying to work on, bringing the stories back to them and the patterns back to them and saying, is this what we want? Is this what you want for your girls? Or is there something that can be done? If so, by whom? So it's integrating monitoring, planning, evaluation, intervention. Okay, I want to just have a pause from the case study and look at weak signals. A lot of evaluation is focused on averages. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. And in SenseMaker, the weak signals are very important because they can show you where the seeds of opportunities for change are, but also the seeds of problems. So these few stories that are in a little corner, for example, are the ones you really want to look at because they can give you those indications of what is important. And it's what I was saying, it's this anticipatory awareness. Averages are fine, but the future is about the weak signals often. So it enables you to combine that. Okay, the only thing I want to tell you about the global giving case is the scale, and then I'll move on to... It basically works the same with getting people, enumerators out there. who then collect the stories. These are volunteer scribes, by the way. They get, I think, 15 or 10 Kenyan shilling per story, so it's not a wage, it's more like a tip. And in the past year and a half, they've collected 40,000 stories from all over. It's now really a problem because I don't know how to analyze it. It's just too large, so you have to think, well, what's the question I want for this particular group? And it's being used by Global Giving in very interesting ways to get new organizations involved, to hold up a mirror to organizations where there's enough stories about them, and to also check in certain regions like Kibera in Nairobi, if these are the issues coming out of Kibera, because it's all geomapped as well, which organizations are tackling it, or is there a gap here? Yes, so it's knowledge management feedback loops. Okay, I wanted to leave then at the end, and I can come back to any of this if the questions warrant it, is to this one. So I've got about 9, I counted 9 different pilots now with SenseMaker. It came from the world of defense and the world of banking and finance. And there's very few experiences with it in development, the ones that I'm involved in, and then a couple of others. But what I'm getting back that people are valuing is human voice, narratives. People are back in the picture. Scalable ethnography, this notion of numbers matching, being equally present as the stories. You're not talking about a few case studies that are impossible to generalize. It's very hard to game. The attitude survey, the problem with the attitude survey in Rwanda was that it said things like, do you as a parent believe that a girl has as much right to school as a boy? You know what the socially desirable answer is, but how do you formulate it differently? And the way that the questions are framed in SenseMaker make it much more difficult to game. A lot of the visible, the intangible becomes visible, issues around voice, agency, power relationships, and it connects decision support, monitoring, and planning in a tight loop, as it were. So the pain points that I see for evaluation, and it'd be very interesting to hear if you see of others. One is, are we comfortable with ambiguity? Working with patterns is not the same as having a definitive answer. And some of the water engineers with whom I work find it a very, very uncomfortable place to be. They say, how can I be certain that this stuff is really true? It's like, well, as much as any other method. But so how comfortable are we with ambiguity? The second aspect is that I'm not asked to pronounce as an evaluator anymore. I'm guiding people's own discovery about what matters in their context. So I think some of you will be encountering Michael Patton soon. He will talk about choices we make about the relationships that we have with organizations we work for. And another one that I'm finding interesting with people is the notion of anecdotes. We're really in the business of fact-finding, right? Replicable facts, preferably. These are a lot of anecdotes. Maybe the girls are telling lies about throwing a baby in the toilet, who knows? But if there's 191 of 339 all saying something related to violence, does that then give anecdotes a status of fact? And that's a very uneasy place as well, where some of our thinking has to shift. So this is where I wanted to leave it. I gather you now have time for questions and answers, or yeah, that's it for me.
I want to thank Irene. I think we've heard experience that very few people in this global world have with trying out a very a new method and applying it to evaluation. I myself am still there struggling with the idea of, as an evaluator, looking at the patterns before I look at the stories, right? Very, very different way of working, and one that, in my experience and my training, is hard to get your head around. And that's part of what makes this so new. So part of our goal has been to bring you innovation and evaluation, what people are talking about. I think that this is a very profound and different way of looking at data, at looking at patterns, and it's the numbers that are giving this some strength and raising the interest of organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation. Irene has graciously said that she will take some questions. She would like them. We'll do maybe taking 3 at a time if we have them. Because this is being filmed, we have a little bit of a different format. And if you have a question, I hope many of you do, we're going to ask you to come forward and make a line here. We'll take 2 or 3 at a time, and you will have to speak into the microphone here. So we won't be passing it around like we normally do. This is come on up. And we look forward to some of your questions on this.
Aisha, I come from Uganda. I work with Stroma Foundation. Thank you very much, Irene, for sharing with us this innovation. I have 2 questions. One of them is, I am very familiar with the work of a gentleman called Rick Davis, and I've been able to use the most significant change. And my question is, how has the sense maker compared with the most significant change? Is there a difference? Then the other question is, what are the limitations that you've found so far in applying this method? Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks. Great questions.
Hello, I'm Judith from Rwanda. First of all, I would like to really commend you for the work you're doing. I know the Rwandan culture, people are very, very sensitive. We don't talk so much about ourselves, but I'm really very surprised that you have managed to get all these stories out of the girls. My first question is the criteria of choosing these girls, and where do you mainly pick them? You managed to answer most of the other questions that lined up. Thank you so much. And the last question is, would you please maybe I think you mentioned this briefly towards the end, but would you please throw more light on how you guard against manipulation of information, really getting the right information out of these girls? Thank you so much.
Ahmed from Yemen. Somewhere you mentioned from Kenya you reported a story about Shabab in Somalia, if I understand correctly. Who report what, in what context, and why it was moving, and sources of credibility, please.
Would you introduce yourself?
Ahmed from Yemen. Yes.
All right. Rick Davies. Rick Davies was my PhD supervisor. So I know the most significant change work well, and I used it in my own work in Brazil. It's actually really quite different. The main difference that I see with most significant change is that it filters out stories, whereas we're interested in mass scale. When you use most significant change, it goes through layers, and all of the maybe 30 stories you have, one is remaining. And I've used this method in Brazil, and I found that peer pressure and social relationships was often the deciding factor about which story actually made it to the top, not whether people really thought it was the most significant one. But from a complexity perspective, those 24 that are lost in the most significant change process, Benjamin, I can't see where you sit down. There you are. I wanted to look at you. You discard 24 pixels on your screen, 24 stitches in your tapestry, and that is such a waste. Yeah. So I find that's one thing. The other thing that I find is that the actual wording of saying what is the most significant change is actually skewing the data to be about extremes. Yeah? Whereas what SenseMaker is about, it's about having these extra antenna in your system through the story process. It's saying actually all, not just the extremes, all experiences are important for my understanding of what matters at this moment in time. So there's a few other details, but on those two fronts, I would say they differ a lot. Yeah? And then there's the actual applications. Limitations. I found that limitations vary per organization. So in one organization, the data collection will actually be a real hassle because they just don't have the networks, or they don't have the imagination or even the resources to figure out how to get the number, the scale of stories. It was certainly not a problem for Global Giving, 40,000 in 1.5 years. In others, it's the actual analysis phase where they are scratching their heads and are saying, oh my goodness, how do we now tackle this? And it has to do, and then in the other, some organizations have problems with then bringing it back, closing the loop as it were, bringing it back to the people where you want the discussion to be had. So in terms of, well, and then there's the limitation, and that's an interesting one, is it's proprietarial, I think that's the word, software. In fact, I submitted a request to AEA for giving a workshop on it to share the experience, and it was rejected because it was proprietarial software, which I understand. And I think, well, but on the other hand, it's really interesting, and they're working on really reducing the price, and everything we use has a cost. But that's a limitation, and I really see that limitation. It would be fantastic if it could be free. Okay, so Judith from Rwanda, criteria for choosing girls. In the Rwanda case, it was really simple because we are interested in tracking the impact, eventually, of the work that Girl Hub is doing in Rwanda. So it's working with specific groups of girls in the 12 Plus program, so it's the girls in the 12 Plus program. And maybe that is why they were less inhibited to share stories, because they've already been together for 6 months and have a relationship of discussion, because that's what the program is around. We're going to expand that, though, to views from the street, as it were. So it's going to be opened up to whoever wants to share. And there's an interesting, I'm not a statistician, but it's an interesting question for statisticians, is at what point does it not matter anymore because you've got such massive numbers? Yeah? I don't have the answer to that, but it's an interesting question. Which brings me to guarding against manipulation of information. I think there are a number of sources, and it relates a little bit to your point, Benjamin, about limitations. And in fact, it ties into Ahmed's questions about the work in Kenya. You have to, data can be manipulated at point of collection, right? And frankly, whether it's this method or that method or that method, it's all the same. It can all be manipulated. And so I don't think SenseMaker is an exception in that sense. Yeah, surveys, we all know, can be highly manipulated. Case studies, perhaps, where you have multiple sources and they verify and it's triangulated, or it's easier to figure out where there are aspects of a case study which might not be, quite the pure truth. So, so that's one source of manipulation of information. Again, the question is whether when it's done at scale and the patterns remain overwhelmingly strong, does that mean that everybody's lying and everyone's manipulating, or does it mean that really, in fact, there's a lot there that is useful? You can also have manipulation in uploading, and I wouldn't say it's manipulation as much as distortion. When it's uploaded, we collect on paper, and it's then uploaded into a database. If you have the cross, if you do it in the wrong place, as it were, then you obviously get distortion of data. We're trying with LiveScribe pens, these pens that automatically upload data. We're working on iPad, not we, Dave. I'm not part of the company, by the way. Don't need to sell the stuff. iPad applications are being developed, and smartphone applications. So it's much more, it's quicker. You don't have to go through the whole transcription process. But Judith, I don't know if that's what you meant when you said manipulation of information. Is it about people telling the truth or the distortions in the system? Okay. There's a really sorry? Yes, okay. So you can also have you can have distortion of findings because you don't adequately select the story sources. That's what you were saying? Is that right? Who is deciding? Well, I gave the example of Rwanda where it's the girls in the program, and that is, gosh, that's a Ministry of Health decision where they say, okay, we're starting in these 4 districts, let's sample a bunch of rural schools and let's sample a bunch of urban schools, and then which girls who are 12 are interested and have permission of their parents. And it's for the pilot, but it's going to be scaled up. And I think they have plans now to go to 120,000 girls in the next 3 years or something. Yeah. But in other cases, it is a problem. And for example, in the water service delivery application, I'm really working with them to get their sampling frame much tighter because it's just too random. And this is a question I have about the global giving work. It is like a machine gun, scattered from the whole countryside of Kenya. And what does that do to, how do you use that type of, seriously, it's not actually random, it's just the stuff that comes in. Okay, Ahmed, your question, where are you? Your question, I'm not sure I quite understood it. You want to hear more about the example from Kenya. Okay, I can't tell you a lot about it because it's a sensitive topic, but essentially we were trying to understand how does violence play out amongst youth? Is it? How is it there? How are they experiencing it? How does morality come into it? And so we had a very, very open question, simply asking people. We had about 2,000 stories that were collected over a couple of months, and we asked, give examples of struggles between right and wrong, and in your community, right? And we were trying, and so you have to. It's such an incredibly impossible topic to face head on that you have to look at it very, very indirectly. The conclusion in that application was that actually for a diagnostic purpose, it was really, really useful, but probably for an evaluative purpose, it was less useful. And this comes back to the limitations question, because the work that was going on in the background in terms of community development, they weren't tracking who was being exposed to it or not. So it was impossible to have anything like a cohort and any kind of comparisons. We just, all you could say is, well, let's measure in 2 years' time or in 6 months' time, and are there similar patterns coming out from a random sample in that community? So that's the way, in fact, in which we are tracking with baselines in Ethiopia and in Rwanda, how this is shifting.
Thank you. Don't go, Irene. Very good. We are going to bring this to a close. I know some of you have reading that you have to do yet for tomorrow, so the evening has grown late enough. I want to thank Irene for coming all this way to share with us, again, something that is cutting edge, a method that you're going to be hearing more about as the technology also increases and we're able to collect these stories on an even vaster, greater scale in even less amount of time. I think in the future we'll probably also see some interesting experiments between sort of at the same time that you have an experimental design or a strong quasi-experimental design, also using SenseMaker. Do you get the same stories? Are they complementary in terms of the picture that you get? Or are you confronting different realities that somehow you're going to have to make sense of? I think there will be more experimentation in the future like that to look at these different methods and try to use them at the same time. So it's been, I think, informative, really interesting to to hear this, and I really thank Irene much for coming. We have a little paperweight for you, a little gift, and again, you're in the private sector, so I know you can take this, and we don't have to worry, but still its monetary value is below whatever ceiling you can possibly have. So,
And
again,
very much appreciated. Thank
I
you.
want you to join me in thanking Irene for this presentation tonight. Thank you.